theory of gravitation became popular was explaining much smaller deviation than the deviation in the orbit of Uranus. Instead, he saw a tiny precession of the perihelion of Mercury, and he was able to explain that. But, you know, that's much smaller than Uranus. Uranus we explained by finding another planet. That we explained by finding another theory. You know, so what that suggests is that it was really the beauty of Einstein's theory and its ability to unify a lot of things, rather than like this one prediction that it was able to make about the path of Mercury that actually led it to be accepted. And therefore, most of what goes on in science, most of the most famous things that you learned about in school in science, really have nothing to do with this middle school view of hypothesis, test, repeat, etc. Okay. So instead, what Putnam suggests most of science is puzzle solving. And that usually happens in steps. So what you sort of do is you know something about the world. You know some fact, and you try to think of simple assumptions you could make about what's going on in the world, which would help you explain this fact given the theory. Right? This is what Putnam calls his schema 2. Then you take those assumptions and you do a mathematical derivation, which helps you figure out what the implications of those assumptions are for other things that go on in the world. So that's what Putnam calls his schema 3. And it's most of what goes on in theoretical economics, theoretical physics, and so forth. You take a set of assumptions and you try to deduce what the conclusions of those are. And then finally, once you have the assumptions and you've deduced what their conclusions are, you might go out and test some of those conclusions. And that might seem like an inductivist approach, but failure in that stage would never lead you to falsify the theory. It would lead you to falsify the solution to the puzzle that had been proposed in the first place, right? And so you would go back to the drawing board and try to find another solution to the puzzle. You wouldn't reject the theory on which the whole process was based. On the other hand, that doesn't mean everything is totally subjective. Why? Because the way a theory gains its adherence is by having really compelling examples of puzzles that it has solved in the past. Right? So if you think about, you know, why did I present you with this thing by Friedman? Well, my hope is that you would say, wow, it's really interesting that economic analysis can give us this sort of totally different diagnosis of what's going on in this situation than anything else. And it was based on pretty simple, you know, descriptions and assumptions of what is actually going on in the medical industry. And so the successes of a theory have to come out of sort of simple, compelling arguments that they make about why things are a certain way. They can't just come out of, you know, really elaborate ad hoc, you know, attempts to deal with problems. And so the more compelling solutions are, the more likely it is to attract people to want to major in that field, to want to eventually become scientists in that field, and so forth. You know, if you ask yourself, why did you end up majoring in economics rather than sociology or anthropology, it was probably because you went to some economics class and you said, wow, that's a really, you know, interesting way to explain what's going on here, right? Or that's a really compelling way to explain what's going on here. And so when theories are competing, the amount of compelling, simple, elegant solutions they're able to give determines whether they're able to succeed or not. And therefore, theories really aren't subjective, but they're also not falsifiable. So it's sort of neither of these extreme views is the right way of thinking about it. Okay, so we can thus think of theories as sort of languages for talking about things. And the assumptions made in the theory, like, you know, how many planets are there and so forth, are sort of like sentences in that language. And obviously, again, anyone who speaks multiple languages will know that there are certain ideas that are easier to express in some languages than in others. And the value of a theory is then really what it allows us to say, and also what makes it hard for us to say, right? If the theory allows us to say things that are important to the real world events, if it allows us to talk about the financial crisis in an intelligent way, it's going to become more commonly used. if it allows us to say stupid things, which are totally wrong about financial crisis, then it's going to become less popular. And so, as we go through this class and you learn applications of economic theory, you shouldn't really think of these as just applications of the theory, and the theory being the core thing that you should be learning. That would be a bit like if you were to learn a language and memorize all the rules of grammar, but never have actually spoken a sentence in the language, right? The content of the theory, the content of the language, is the actual act of applying it. That is what sort of constitutes the theory rather than the formal rules. And to the extent that there is a way to falsify or to favor one theory or not, it depends on what it makes easier or more difficult to talk about. In reality, this isn't just true of the overall theory. It isn't just overall true of the theory of economics. But there's also sort of sub-theories. So within economics, there's different fields. There's public economics, and there's international economics, and there's industrial economics. Each of these are sort of dialects of economics. Each of them have their own particular sub-languages. And a lot of the point of this class is to teach you many of these different sort of dialects of economics, different ways of, even within the context of the broader perspective of economics, speaking about different types of problems. Before we talk about those particular dialects, I don't know how much time I'll have to talk about the specific topics we'll be covering. I just want to go through Becker's article, which sort of in a very bold and unapologetic way expresses what are the basic sort of ways in which economists broadly tend to talk about things. So, is Emily Shaw here? Yeah. Could you tell me some of the elements that Becker thinks are like characteristic of how economists tend to look at the world differently from others?
He thinks that preferences are stable, that markets regulate how we choose things, basically.
Absolutely.
And that basically everything can be explained in terms of costs as decisions.
So that's exactly right. So economists tend to think there are stable preferences that don't vary that much from person to person, that to the extent that we take preferences from somewhere outside, to the extent that we analyze preferences at all, we usually don't analyze them as economists. We take them from biology or sociology or something external to economics, and we take them as pretty similar and constant across people. And we interpret all the constraints that people face in terms of prices and markets. And the technology, information, and markets provide sort of the constraints on what people are able to do. And a lot of those we derive from sort of physical laws governing production of new products. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it's interesting how this, at least for me, kind of aligns with what Putnam was talking about.
Yeah.
When he talks about preferences, you can't just say, oh, it must be changing preferences.
Yeah.
He's really boldly saying, stick to your guns, don't change the theory, and just, you can't say he's saying, if you see there's something different, the theory's not wrong, you can't blame preferences, there might be like a shadow price. In terms of,
yeah, so that's exactly.
Maybe there's a planet hiding out.
That's exactly the perspective. Remind me again of your name.
David Hampton?
David Hampton. Yep. So that's it. I think that's exactly sort of how these things line up with one another. Is that Becker's exactly saying that you always have to complete the theory in some way. The theory itself of rationality and whatever doesn't itself have content. The question is, what costs do we take into account? And sort of anytime we see an inconsistency between economic theory and something in the world, we can try to find a way to account for the costs that might have led to that type of behavior. And therefore economists avoid thinking about shifts in preferences, about things like luck, or about confusion by consumers. Now, I don't think this is necessarily the only approach, or even the best approach to thinking about problems, but what I do hope is that in the spirit of Putnam, you'll find that this way of approaching problems is a quite useful discipline on your thinking. that it provides sort of a powerful baseline against which to compare things which aren't really consistent with it, and that it provides a pretty useful approach for analyzing even problems that are not traditionally thought of as economic problems. So to give some examples of that, let's go through the ones that Becker discusses in the